people are in very dire, drastic economic straits in this country. People are in jobs. That biggest problem is that people are in jobs that just don't pay them enough money. They can't live on what they make. They struggle. They struggle every day to put food on the table. They struggle to get their kids to school, and most often these days they can't do that, and they're saddened because they can't give their kids the opportunity that maybe they were given by their families. They don't retire. They don't take vacations. They are afraid that they're going to get sick. They have no sick days. Their wages have been stagnant, for decades. Before the recession and since that, their wages have collapsed.
Hi, I'm Igor Volsky.
I'm Michelle Jawando.
And welcome back to Thinking Cap. We just heard from Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro on the struggles Americans still face during an economic recovery that hasn't increased wages and hasn't brought the middle class to where it historically was, which is good paying jobs that support families and allow for real upward mobility.
It goes back to that Democratic adage, it's the economy, stupid.
Yeah.
I do think that there is a conversation that happens among, I think, ordinary, everyday Americans about what resources you have, what resources you don't have, and does this opportunity provide enough for your family? It's just, that's it. It's basic. But there's a very different conversation that takes place in the halls of Congress about what they're doing to help those families. And quite frankly, those conversations are completely disconnected. And I think, unfortunately, there is less and less action, resources, legislation, or policy that's driven to help these families.
Well, this week, the House of Representatives released its budget. And here in D.C., you hear a lot of conversation about your budget reflects your priorities. Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, then a budget that cuts $203 billion from programs like Medicare and Medicaid really says everything you need to know about what Republicans are really trying to do. Earlier, I sat down with Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, who pointed out the great disparity between the kind of economic populist campaign Trump ran and the kind of economic policies he's now embracing.
Look, I don't believe he will make good on any promises that he had made to people. But he told them that he was going to get their jobs back. He told them that he was going to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. Trade was a very, very big issue. Trade was about jobs and wages that people were struggling. And he said to them, what do you have to lose? I'm not suggesting that there was any agenda attached to it. And now what we find out is that it is an agenda that is so contrary to the interests. Let's take a look at the Affordable Care Act.
Let's do that.
When the rhetoric went to reality about the benefits of the Affordable Care Act, we've got millions of people all over this country standing up on their feet and saying, don't repeal the Affordable Care Act. And that is the understanding that, in fact, this is something that is beneficial, and that when we will look at what will happen in this budget, when he cuts job training, when he cuts a food stamp program, when he cuts Social Security disability, which he is intending to do, when he will cut back $5.8 billion in mental health services, when it's $193 billion in a cut to a food stamp program, when the reality begins to set in and we have to be talking to people about this. I think what Donald Trump did was, without any basis or out any agenda or proposal that he will make good on in creating jobs and increasing wages, that he sold them a bill of goods, and we did not have a robust progressive message on the other side.
What should we be doing?
Well, what we should do is to acknowledge that, first of all, there needs to be an acknowledgement that people are in trouble, that they are struggling, and they're struggling every day. We need to identify with that struggle, and that then start with the premise that we know that what your life is about, and that struggle which says you can't make it week to week. And we want to work with you to do something about that. I've been down this road before. Mm-hmm. I was here when Newt Gingrich came to power, and it was the contract with America. What did he want to do? $270 billion cut to Medicare for tax cuts for the rich.
Sounds familiar.
Sounds familiar. He wanted to eliminate the school lunch program. He wanted to block grant the food stamp program. These are all very similar issues that we face today when you look at $193 billion in a cut to the food stamp program. We fought it. We mobilized the country. Today we have a school lunch program. The food stamp program has not been block granted, and they didn't cut $270 billion from the Medicare program. We can win if we go out and we identify with the struggle that people are here today and work to mobilize the public and fight back. That's what we need to do now. I think progressives are very ready to do it. The country is ready. There's great energy in the country today.
Yeah.
And that needs to get harnessed. It was witnessed in the pulling of the bill, the first affordable health care bill. Not the affordable health care bill, but the first repeal bill.
March 20th.
That's right. And it wasn't because members of Congress were on their feet. We were talking about it, but it was the millions of people who called, who marched, who wrote, that said, don't do this, it is at your peril.
Congressman Rosa DeLauro, thank you so much for joining us on Thinking Cap.
Sometimes when you hear about the budget and these cuts, you don't understand it. It feels too far away, so esoteric. You don't know how it affects you or your family or your friends or your loved ones. And that's why we brought on Harry Stein. He is the Director of Fiscal Policy here at the Center for American Progress to help us really understand what's in the House budget and what it means for you and I. Harry, welcome to Thinking Cap.
Good to be on.
So, okay, Harry, we often, Americans, we think about our household budgets. We understand that process, but we know that budgets for the federal government are very different. So Trump put out his budget a few weeks ago. We now see that the House has put out their budget. Help us make sense of what these two documents are and how it affects you and I.
So, in a sense, they're wish lists. That's what the Trump budget is it's his plan. But as it turns out, the House budget looks a lot like the Trump budget. So both of these budgets have huge cuts to Medicaid in them, huge cuts to food stamps, and both support very big tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires and corporations. And what the budget resolution does is sort of two different things. There's the grand vision of governing if the House Republicans were king, what would America look like? So they'd be turning Medicare into a voucher program. They make Medicaid cuts that are actually a lot larger than what was in the ACA repeal bills that they were talking about that took insurance away from tens of millions of people. They actually want to cut Medicaid a lot more than that if they could do whatever they wanted. Now, even if they pass the budget, that doesn't become law. But what it does do is it sets up a process that's called budget reconciliation. And that means that Congress can pass a bill without having to worry about a filibuster in the Senate. So they can pass a bill without any Democratic votes. And that bill that comes after they pass a budget resolution could have a lot of these cuts in it.
What are, and you mentioned the very deep cuts beyond even what we see in the health care bill for Medicaid in the budget, but you haven't really heard that as a rallying cry in the same way. You haven't heard people out in the street saying, don't cut the budget, don't use these Medicaid cuts as it pertains to the budget. Why not?
I think that the cuts aren't real to people until they're in legislation that might actually pass, go to the president's desk, and get signed into law. So, for years now, but we should take this seriously. For years now, the Republicans have passed budgets that look a lot like this. I mean, this goes back to those old Ryan budgets. And, Ryan's still Speaker. This really is just another Ryan budget. And a lot of attention got paid to those budgets initially, and especially when Paul Ryan was the vice presidential nominee. But they kept passing those afterwards in Obama's second term, and people, I think, were less and less interested in what was in them. But what we're seeing now in the healthcare debate is what a mistake that is, because these cuts do get real when they have a chance to make them. And so they've for years been talking about repealing the Affordable Care Act, making huge cuts to Medicaid, and giving huge tax cuts to millionaires and billionaires. I think that we really heard the outcry on that when it got taken out of the abstract context of a budget resolution, which is really just kind of big numbers and, hard to understand legislative text, and again, it does not become a law. But once that became a real bill that went to CBO and got scored, and we actually saw, here's what this means, here's how many people lose coverage, that's when it really got real for people.
Harry, I think a lot about working middle-class families and the constant pressure that you feel, whether or not it is raising your children or taking care of aging parents, trying to save for retirement. And there just seems to be a number of real budget hardship that these families all across this country are faced with. And you heard this president run on this kind of idea of populism, and yet in proposal after proposal or opportunity after opportunity, you don't see any legislation to help on those problems. You see an administration going in an opposite direction. What do you expect from this administration in any way, shape, or form are ideas or proposals that could help families suffering with some of those challenges?
So the budget director, Mick Mulvaney, wrote a piece recently about what he called MAGA-nomics, Make America Great Again nomics. And when you read the piece, though, you heard from this president when he was campaigning things that sounded like they might actually be good for working people. But when you read this piece, it's just basically taking trickle-down economics, the same thing that Republicans have been talking about with like the Bush tax cuts that mainly helped the wealthiest. It's the same trickle-down economics that only helps the wealthy with just a dumber name than trickle-down. And trickle-down's a pretty dumb name already.
We should note trickle-down economics is this theory popularized under President Reagan that if you cut taxes for the very rich, they will be able to grow the economy, and the benefits of that will trickle down to everybody else.
Exactly, except they never trickle down. And that's all that MAGA-nomics is. That this MAGA-nomics is just, it offers nothing to working people. It's just, let's cut taxes for the wealthy, deregulate corporations, and hope that somehow that's going to trickle down and help everyone else. And we know that that's not how the economy works.
So, Harry, but let's debunk that. Why doesn't trickle-down economics work? In other words, there is some logic to the fact that if you...
The job creators, as they always say.
If you peel back some regulations from job creators, if you make it easier for them to grow their businesses without going through regulatory processes, if they have to pay less in taxes, they'll be able to invest that money into growing their businesses and creating new jobs. But that doesn't appear to be happening.
Right. So there are ways that you can make assumptions in economic models that you draw on a whiteboard that would show trickle down working. And this is where you'll sometimes see these, analyses that show, here's how tax cuts can pay for themselves. But we know that that's not how it works. And what we've seen more and more is that real economic growth actually comes from the middle class. That the way you get a business to create jobs and hire and pay better wages is by empowering the middle class to be consumers of their products. You need a strong middle class that can actually buy from businesses, and for that matter, a strong workforce that can actually, take good jobs and be productive. That's where you're boosting productivity in this economy, is not just by having a few wealthy people at the top with a bit more money to throw around, but by having broadly based a big productive workforce where the whole country is contributing to economic growth, not just a few people at the top. So both people contributing to economic growth and investing in productivity, investing in things like infrastructure, education, research. So this is, economic research that when you give kids Medicaid and food stamps back years ago, those kids grow into better educated and more productive adults. Of course, we should just be ensuring basic living standards for everyone. But
that grand concept.
But that is, in fact, how the economy works, that when you're not just immiserating people and letting people actually reach their potential, that's good for everybody.
When we first came to America, we were on food stamps, and look at me now.
There
That's
you
what
go.
I said.
There you
Harry,
go.
let me ask you about this idea of investing in jobs. A lot of the jobs that provided a middle-class living and allowed people to really to grow their families and send their children to college. Those jobs in manufacturing, for instance, have left, and they're really not coming back. And I rarely hear a conversation about what the jobs of the future look like and what we should be training our new workforce and what kind of skills we should be giving them so that they have the skills necessary to fill the jobs of the future. And I was wondering if you've spent time thinking about that.
Absolutely. So I don't think that there's a silver bullet answer here, but to the extent that there's something kind of big picture, it's that we need to be prioritizing full employment as a policy need in this country. And we have not oftentimes done that. So a few examples here. I mean, this is kind of wonky and technical, but very important. What you're doing in monetary policy at the Federal Reserve matters a great deal. And the Federal Reserve is supposed to balance inflation and unemployment. Well, the Fed's basically continues to have less inflation than what they're targeting. And in the meantime, wages are stagnant. And so we need just basically a monetary policy that is more focused on jobs. We also need a fiscal policy like that. And so you think about, especially in the aftermath of the Great Recession, how quickly we went from trying to create jobs and get out of the recession to this austerity policy where we were just cutting from programs that create jobs. And that was a huge mistake. So that's big picture. But looking kind of more, I guess, micro, I think there's a lot that you can do on the green energy side. There's more people employed in solar jobs than in coal jobs. By the way, the House is considering spending bills that are under this budget that would make huge cuts to energy efficiency and renewable energy. That's the last thing that we should be doing if we're thinking about where the jobs of tomorrow are. We should be making college more affordable, making it so anybody can attend community college, make K-12 good, invest in early childhood education, and I mean, that means putting money into these things. And instead, we've been cutting them, and college has gotten less and less affordable. The House is thinking about freezing the maximum Pell Grant award, which is also a policy that we see endorsed by the budget because of the spending levels that it's supporting. And when you freeze the Pell Grant award as college gets more expensive, that means it's harder and harder for people to afford to go to college.
Harry, as you think about what a progressive vision of fiscal policy in this country would look like, where do you start, and what should progressives be advocating and looking to hear from their elected officials?
I think the most important thing is to start with jobs and wages. And so we need to be, and job quality. So we need a policy that invests in infrastructure and that creates jobs and prioritizes that. We need a policy that ensures that everybody has access to paid leave and affordable child care. I mean, a lot of people have to leave the workforce not because they want to, but because they have no other choice, because child care is so inexpensive, and you're not able, and we have a lot of people that can't balance their work and their family obligations because they lack paid leave. There's policies out there that we should be doing. And in all these cases, these policies, they take money. There's this false sense in this country that there's a debt crisis hanging, like a looming debt crisis that we're about to hit. And that's just not true. The country's fiscal system is actually quite strong. So we don't want to be we don't want to be hopeless about these things and think that America can't do big things anymore. Progressive fiscal policy should recognize, no, we can invest in infrastructure, we can have childcare and paid leave. And one very important thing to do to get there is to finally make sure that wealthy people are paying their fair share in taxes. So if you're looking for a progressive fiscal policy, you should be asking, what are we doing to make sure that corporations aren't ducking out of their tax obligation by, using all sorts of accounting gimmicks? And what are we doing to make sure that the top 1% don't have better access to tax, aren't getting tax preferences that no one else gets? There's a lot of policy in this country, a lot of fiscal policy that gets made through the tax code. And it's sort of hidden from view, these tax deductions and things like that. But oftentimes they benefit the wealthy more than anyone else. And a progressive fiscal policy has to be looking at those and saying, how do we make those more equitable? And actually, so when we're giving government subsidies through the tax code or anywhere else, they actually reach the people who need them.
Harry Stein is the Director of Fiscal Policy at the Center for American Progress. Harry, thank you so much for joining us on Thinking Cap.
Thanks for having me on.
Thinking Cap is produced by Sally Tucker. Music by Kyle Epstein and Jacob Buchanan. Graphics by Matt Ingram. For more, find us at Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, and at AmericanProgress.org, or wherever you want.